Hello and welcome to this episode of White Gold Geography. Today we're looking at an adapted, simplified version of the Burgess model. Now, the Burgess model is just a land use model, a land use idea, how people use the land. So we're going to spend most of this time here talking about this chap here. His name is Ernest W. Burgess. He was a sociology professor at the University of Chicago. So sociology is a study of people and their behaviours. He studied what people did, where they lived, and he noticed some patterns. He noticed that certain activities, they were taking place in certain places in the city, and certain buildings in the city were all grouped together. He came up with an idea or a model, and that was the Burgess model or the Burgess idea. He came up with this model in the 1930s, and in many ways, many of the ideas still apply today. He suggested in the centre of the city we have what's called the CBD, the Central Business District. Now, the Central Business District is usually in the centre of a city, and that's going to be where the shops and the offices are. Well, let's go back a few hundred years, and a city would often start off very small. So a city's got to start somewhere, and they start in places, for example, where maybe a castle will be built. And maybe a city grows out from there, and that's because it's a defensive point. It's maybe on the bend of a river. It's easy to defend. A city might start where there's a bridging point over a river, so there's a route there. And suddenly, that's where people gather. And if people gather, that's where services occur and buildings get built. And a bridging point might be where the river is narrowest, and you can easily put a bridge over the river. Here we've got an example of a local market town called Leek, and you can see here those arrows show there's 5 roads coming from all different areas into that place. So it's a crossroads really. So Leek is a crossroads of many different roads, and because lots of people will meet there, then a town has developed. Now the next layout of the CBD, that's where the factories and industries would have arrived. And in the 1800s, 1900s in Stoke-on-Trent, typically those would have been pottery factories. Now the next zone out is an area of terraced houses. So those on the top right of the screen there, you can see those are houses that are all stuck to each other. And typically, in the old times when they were first built, they would have outside toilets at the bottom of the yard. So typically no garden, maybe a yard. And the streets on the right-hand side, you can see they're typically straight. And the shape of the streets, you can see it's going to be a terraced house. They're usually straight. In terms of street names, usually terraced house streets have words like street or road after them. Next, in the 1930s, these are sometimes called interwar houses, so between the 2 world wars. You can see there, the top left, we've got semi-detached houses. And that's where 2 houses are stuck together. And semi-detached houses arrived, slightly bigger than terraced. People wanted an indoor toilet, maybe a driveway, because cars were more common. And sometimes people used the car to go to work. Whereas the terraced houses, the workers lived in the terraced houses very near to the factories. So that's where the terraced houses are very different. The semi-detached houses, you might have a garden, and the streets, if you look on the top right, they were wide curves, maybe cul-de-sacs, and sometimes the street names would be called Crescent or Place or Avenue. Those are common ending for street names. Next, in the 1980s, you can see the example there, at the bottom left, we've got detached houses. So it's possible to walk all around the house, and it's just one house. So that's a detached house, it's separate from other houses. Maybe larger gardens, more parking, people have more cars. And you can see people are then on the edge of the city, detached houses, and they will commute to work. In terms of the shape of the streets, you can see on the top right, we've got close, we've got road, we've got grove, we've got drive. Those are the street names. But in terms of the shape of the streets, they're all a bit random, really. So there's a few longer ones and a few shorter ones. The further you move away from the CBD, so that's a central business district, at the top you can see people travel longer distances to work. They'll have to commute. They'll have to either travel into the CBD or they'll have to travel to another town. The bottom right, you can see the houses generally get larger the further out of the city centre you get. And that is because on the bottom left, you can see the land is cheaper. Now we've got two things going on here. We're going to talk about this particular area called the rural-urban fringe. This is where the city meets the countryside. The image that we've got there is a detached house. That's the outer zone, usually. The next image, we've got the countryside. Now the countryside, that's the rural area, and you can see there's going to be a place in every city where the city stops and the countryside begins. And that's called the rural-urban fringe. So a fringe is just where two things meet. So the edge of the city is called the rural-urban fringe. So here we've got a summary of all of what we've learned before. And just to recap the red box, the factories are in the red zone. And of course, in the 1800s, 1900s, people wouldn't have cars to go to work. So the terraced houses in the green zone, they were built near to the factories. People would typically walk to work, walked near where they worked. And then outside of that, the semi-detached, later on, more space. And then outside of that, detached homes. Of particular focus is the rural-urban fringe. That's the edge of the city, where the city meets the countryside. We've got the CBD, an image there. We've got factories on the next zone. We've got terraced houses in the next zone. Semi-detached houses in the next zone. And detached houses in the next zone. There's all kinds of exceptions to where this might occur in the city. So this isn't perfect. And then finally, we've got the rural-urban fringe. Here's an interesting one. We've got the factories and we've got rural. So what we've got is, where do we build the new houses? We've got a choice. Now the factories nowadays, a lot of the old pottery factories, they're now derelict and that land can now be reused. So the question is, where do we build new houses? We can build them in the factory zone, because a lot of those factories are no longer there, or we can build them on the rural zone. Or they can build on the rural-urban fringe at the edge of the city. So where do we build new houses?